The Right on Point podcast is a candid discussion of your legal rights, civil liberty ramifications, legalities of possible mandates of COVID vaccines, and actions by our federal government and state governments. Plus exploring the untouchable topics within the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the PrEP Act, and the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. Welcome to the Right on Point podcast with Wayne Rohde.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for watching today. This is the Right on Point podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Rohde. Believe it or not, this is our 62nd episode of the Right on Point podcast, season 2. So we've been after it since November of 2020. Joining me today is my producer, video technician, Ben Smith from Backroads Media. How you doing today, Ben?
Oh, well above average. Well above average, Wayne. Always good to be here.
Good, thank you. I know that you're excited. Do you remember back when Dr. Peter McCullough came to Minneapolis in January? It happened to be the coldest day of the year, and we got this native Texan to come up from Dallas, Texas to Minnesota and freeze, but he was very informative. Yeah, but it's just people that we had a sold out crowd and everybody loved his message, and it was just unbelievable. People around the world are wanting to hear the truth about what's happening in the COVID pandemic, and I'm so glad and happy to get that word out. You were a big part of that. And today's guest is someone else that I've been wanting to talk with for a long time. It's going to be really fantastic, listeners, so pay attention. One of the topics that's really been kind of bugging me a lot is this natural immunity. And, public health in the United States here has been saying that's disinformation, that's misinformation. We don't have natural immunity, and it doesn't exist, which is a bunch of garbage. And my guest today is going to tell us a lot about natural immunity, plus how the variants affect us, and possibly why mass vaccination is very problematic in a pandemic. So here today, live from Belgium, is my pleasure to welcome Geert Vanden Bossche to the Right on Point podcast. How you doing today, sir?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks, Wayne, for having me. We are very, very busy, as you know, but I'm still mentally and physically fine. So I'm happy about it.
Well, good. I'm very happy you're here. I kind of want to take off on what your interview was with Dr. Philip McMillan a while back, that you talked about. It's very problematic if we have a mass vaccination program during a pandemic. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that we do not usually do this. We usually use vaccines in a prophylactic way. That means that we use vaccines to prevent diseases or infections. And so, for example, when you travel to a foreign country where there is an infectious disease that you can be protected against by taking a vaccine, you would always make sure that you take that vaccine before you go there, and that you get your full vaccination course before you get exposed, basically, or you get potentially exposed to that threat, to that infection. Or, for example, you plan on working into a hospital and people require you to be vaccinated against hepatitis B because there is a certain risk that you could contract the infection while working in the hospital. Then you will always make sure that you get your full vaccination course before you start working in the hospital, so that you have your full-fledged immunity in place, so that your immune system is fully ready to tackle the bug, so to say. If you are vaccinating while you are already potentially exposed to the infection, then this is very problematic. Why? Well, it will take time for your immune system to build a full-fledged immunity. Unless or until you have built this full-fledged immunity, your immune system is not fully capable of fighting the pathogen. And in the meantime, because you do this during a pandemic, you can already get exposed to the virus. Remember, when people are vaccinated, they are not quarantined. You get your first shot, you get your second shot, and you can the next day or the same day, you can be exposed to the virus with an immune response that is insufficient, that is suboptimal because it is not fully mature. And so that means that you leave the door open to the virus to replicate. Of course, the virus will become under pressure because it doesn't like you to mount antibodies against it. But the immune response is not sufficiently strong to prevent the virus from replicating. So as long as it can replicate, it can mutate, and it can select certain mutants, we call them variants, that are strong enough to completely overcome the pressure that you have put. You're putting pressure without being able to kill the virus because the immune response is insufficient. And that is how you start to select variants that are more infectious, that have a higher capability of infecting the susceptible cells. And if you do this on a large scale, then not just yourself or me or other people who got vaccinated, but large chunks of the population will be giving a preference to the replication of those variants that are capable to overcome this immune pressure. And that is how these more infectious variants become dominant. So it's very important to understand that mass vaccination has not led to the mutations. When viruses are replicating, you get mutations all the time. What the mass vaccination has done during a pandemic is that it has put a large scale immune pressure on the virus, and that because of that, variants that are more infectious have been selected on a large scale, not just in your body, not just in somebody else's body, but in many, many people that got vaccinated. And that is how these more infectious variants become dominant. So the mass vaccination the effect of the mass vaccination has been that variants that are more infectious, first of all, have been selected. And secondly, because of the large-scale vaccination, that they have become dominant in the population. So the dominance of naturally selected variants that existed already before the mass vaccination, but had no fitness advantage, they had no advantage towards other strains because there was no competitive immune pressure environment. The immune pressure has been generated by the mass vaccination, and by doing so, you all of a sudden give what Darwin called a fitness advantage to strains that happen to be, by way of mutation, more infectious. And that is how these guys become dominant. And that's how you have seen that you had this succession of dominance, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, now Omicron, etc. So that is why it is so dangerous to do mass vaccination during a pandemic, because you are simply going to promote the expansion and the propagation of more and more infectious variants that finally will become more resistant to the vaccines, that finally will overcome also, let's say, the pressure of the immune system to keep the virus or to prevent the virus from causing severe disease. That's what we are seeing right now. People think Omicron is just fine because it doesn't cause severe disease. People don't realize that the reason why Omicron is not causing severe disease is because the immune system is right now putting immune pressure on what we call the virulence of the virus. The virulence of the virus is the capability of the virus to cause severe disease, to become very pathogenic, right? So that is very, very misleading, even obviously to our health officials who think that Omicron is a blessing because it's very infectious. They think everybody's going to get herd immunity and it doesn't cause severe disease. That is not true. Just like at the beginning, people were told, well, the vaccines are going to diminish, to reduce the transmission and make the virus more infectious. And for some time, this has been the case. But we then realized that in fact, all we are doing with these vaccines is in fact putting immune pressure on the infectiousness of the virus. What has been the result? The virus has overcome that immune pressure by becoming more infectious, for example, like Omicron. And now Omicron is very infectious, but it is only poorly virulent. It only causes mild disease. So people don't seem to understand that what is happening right now is that all what the vaccines are doing, the only thing they're still doing is to suppress the severity of the infection, and that again, the virus will also overcome this hurdle in order to become not only highly infectious and resistant to the vaccines, but even to become highly virulent. And then we have, of course, a catastrophic problem. If you have a bug circulating that is infectious, that causes severe disease, and that you cannot protect against by the vaccines, on the contrary, the vaccines are enhancing the infectiousness of the virus, then this is pretty catastrophic. What else could I say?
Okay, well, the Omicron, yeah, you're correct. Everybody thought that it's more aggressive as far as infections, but it was less virulent. But what you're saying is sooner or later we're going to break out with a killer type variant. Now, Omicron is a little bit different than the other variants that we've seen in the past, and that is how it affects the body. You know, Omicron is the upper respiratory. The rest of them have been the lower respiratory system. This new variant that's kind of coming across Europe and now hitting the United States, what is it, 1BA2 or something, whatever they call it? How is that different than Omicron, or is it similar to Omicron?
Yeah. Well, there is two things one needs to understand. First of all, I will comment on your first, on your first question or comment that it seems to be a different virus because it is primarily replicating at the upper respiratory tract. Let me be very, very clear. So we have come to a situation, and this is very, very important for everybody to understand. We have come to a situation where the behavior of the virus is no longer dependent on the virus itself, but on the combination of the virus with the antibodies that are generated. So let me explain this. We know that Omicron is now largely resistant to the vaccinal antibodies that are being generated. So, but what that means is that when you have an infection, for example, with Omicron, you not only induce neutralizing antibodies, but you also induce antibodies that are not neutralizing. Okay. If the neutralizing antibodies don't bind anymore because the neutralizing capacity of the antibodies has diminished due to resistance, that's almost like the definition, then the non-neutralizing antibodies will primarily bind to the virus. What that means is that by the fact that the non-neutralizing antibodies can now bind to the virus, they make the virus more infectious. So in other words, the enhanced infectiousness that we are seeing with Omicron in vaccinees, it's documented, peer-reviewed journals that vaccinees are now more susceptible, way more susceptible to infection with Omicron than the unvaccinated. That is due to the fact that there is a resistance of Omicron to the vaccinal neutralizing antibodies. Hence, the non-neutralizing antibodies, they are now playing a key role in that they can bind to the virus and make the virus more infectious. So the enhanced infectiousness is primarily due to the non-neutralizing antibodies. That immediately explains that there are several different variants, in the Omicron family, as long as they have the same common denominator, namely the approximately 20 mutations that cause resistance to the vaccinal antibodies, and they have all these mutations within the receptor binding domain in common, any other mutation can survive and can thrive because in combination, because when they have these 20 mutations, they will be resistant to the vaccinal antibodies. That means the non-neutralizing antibodies will dominate the scene. And the non-neutralizing antibodies are making all these variants more infectious. So in fact, the effectivity of the virus is no longer determined by the virus itself alone. Therefore, it's no longer seasonal, because remember, now during summer, during spring, etc., everybody gets infected. It's no longer age dependent, as well young people as older people are, because everybody who has these non-neutralizing antibodies is going to be much more susceptible. Now, the important thing, and I know it's complex, but I need to say this, and this is to your second point, these non-neutralizing antibodies, they have a very particular effect at the lower respiratory tract. So I just explained that at the upper respiratory tract, they will enhance the infectivity of the virus. If you are a vaccinee, they will make you more susceptible to infection. But what they will do at the upper respiratory tract, the very same antibodies, so the very same antibodies that enhance the infection at the upper respiratory tract will inhibit infection of susceptible lung cells or other organ cells, and for example, at the lower respiratory tract or at the liver, wherever the virus goes, and will therefore prevent dissemination of the infection, will prevent systemic disease, will prevent severe disease. And that is the reason why people get the impression that Omicron is limited to the upper respiratory tract, because at the lower respiratory tract, it is inhibited by the very same antibodies that enhance the infection at the upper respiratory tract. So I know it's complicated to understand, but feel free to ask questions.
Okay. So what you're telling me is someone who's not ever been exposed to the virus and is not vaccinated, if they get the Omicron variant, it'll affect the entire respiratory tract, or just, we don't know, right?
Well, let's be very clear. People who are not vaccinated, they have no vaccinal antibodies. There is not even talk about resistance to neutralizing antibodies, because they're not vaccinated. So of course, these people, when they are, for example, not in excellent health, or they are faced with a substantial load of virus, they can of course contract the disease. But most of people, especially younger people, etc., they will recover from that disease. And what this will do is that this will train their innate immunity. So as you have probably heard, and that is very well known, and which has been published as well, is that, for example, young people, especially children, are very well protected against this type of viruses. Also, for example, against influenza viruses. That's, by the way, also the reason why we don't vaccinate children against influenza virus, by their innate antibodies. But as they age, as they grow up, these innate antibodies, the functional concentration of these innate antibodies will diminish. So that means these children will become susceptible, but it's not like they are very well protected today and tomorrow they lose all of a sudden all their innate antibodies and they are very susceptible. This is like a gradual process. So, but as they become more susceptible and as they are, for example, facing a substantial viral load, they can get most of the times mild or moderate disease, because the virus has broken through the innate immune system. To do that, this is kind of like a training for the innate immune system. So that means they get a disease, they will recover from it, but next time around, their innate immune defense that the virus was breaking through is going to be much better prepared to deal with this virus, and will most likely no longer allow the virus to break through this first line of immune defense, which is innate immunity. That is why I'm saying now you will see still that a number of unvaccinated people, primarily those who are maybe not in excellent health, maybe those who are confronted with, people who are shedding a lot of virus, may still contract Omicron infection. And there is a number of unvaccinated people who are getting the infection, of course, but you will be able, your audience will be able to follow this. The unvaccinated that are now getting Omicron recover from it, they will be fine. I bet you they maybe in future, they will maybe, I'm even not certain, get mild disease, but it could very well be that, they are done with this infection. Their innate immunity has been well trained, has been well adapted to deal with this virus, so that the virus will no longer be capable of breaking through this first line of immune defense. So that is very, very important to realize. And this is, of course, a very different situation from the vaccinees, because the vaccinees who develop specific antibodies, they develop specific antibodies against spike. Initially, these antibodies have neutralizing capacity. You hear me saying that now with Omicron, these antibodies have no longer neutralizing capacity. But whether they're neutralizing or non-neutralizing, they bind to spike protein, and by doing so, they will suppress binding of the innate antibodies. So the first line of immune defense is kind of like overridden by these spike-specific antibodies. For a normal vaccination, for example, where you have no variants and where you have a vaccine that is ideally suited, that is well matched with the antigenic constellation of the circulating virus, that is fantastic, because the specific antibodies, they will recognize it very well. There will be no immune escape. And if you are vaccinated outside of an outbreak, outside of a pandemic, you have that full-fledged immune response that is completely matched to the circulating virus, and you will be fine. But we are not in that situation. We are vaccinating during a pandemic, and we are vaccinating with a vaccine that contains a spike protein that is very different from the spike that is now presented on the circulating variants. All this leads to inefficacy of the vaccines, and secondarily will still suppress the innate immunity that, as I was saying, can be trained. And you can maybe ill for a couple of days, but then your innate immunity will be very well trained. Let me also tell you that this nonsense that there is now, many people, unvaccinated people in the hospital, let me explain you what's happening there. You have to imagine that Omicron is now for the unvaccinated. For the unvaccinated, it is serving like a live attenuated vaccine, right? Like a live attenuated vaccine. So every physician, every medical doctor knows that you should never, ever vaccinate a person who has a weak immune system with a live attenuated vaccine. So most of the childhood vaccines are live attenuated vaccines. Every physician knows that if a child is having fever, is not in perfect health, he should definitely not vaccinate a child with a live attenuated vaccine. We also know that we should not vaccinate elderly people, with an immune system that is aging, for example, with live attenuated vaccines. So, in other words, you can answer this question now. Who is right now ending up in the hospital amongst the people that are unvaccinated? These are those people who do not support vaccination with a live attenuated vaccine because they have underlying conditions, underlying morbidities, or they are suffering even intermittently from another disease, and their health is not in very good shape, right? But all the others will at most develop mild or moderate disease. Okay, they can be for 1 or 2 days in bed, who cares? They will recover, they will train their innate immunity, and the innate immunity, in contrast to the vaccine-induced immunity, is not specific for a particular variant. It will broadly recognize all variants. It will even broadly recognize all coronaviruses, right? So that is what is difficult for people to understand, but that is also the strength, of course, of innate immunity, because what these idiots do is that they compare, you would be vaccinated, for example, I take your antibodies and I will in vitro, I will compare your antibodies to the antibodies of an unvaccinated person that has suffered from the disease. Remember, an unvaccinated person can get mild illness or moderate illness and will develop antibodies. And then those antibodies of the unvaccinated will be compared with the antibodies of the non-vaccinated, of the vaccinated. But what they ignore is that the unvaccinated, before they got to that disease, as a consequence of which they developed the antibodies, they have gone through a training exercise of their innate immune system. And it is essentially this one that will primarily protect them next time around. But that is not tested in vitro, right? So the innate immune system in the training and the phenomenal defensive power of that innate immune system is completely ignored, And that is why they are saying, natural immunity, they're just looking at the height, the titers of the antibodies. We know as immunologists, we know that immunology is not about the quantity, it's about the quality of the immune response. Now, I can tell you, the unvaccinated, they have not only trained their innate immune system, but even when the virus breaks through that, they will build specific antibodies that in that case very well match the circulating virus because they have been elicited by the circulating virus. The vaccinees, they are suppressing their innate immune system. They cannot rely on their innate immune system. And on top, they are mounting antibodies that are not well suited for the antigen that is circulating, for the variants. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense here because I was exposed to Delta. I probably had Delta back in August of last year. And for about 3 or 4 days, I had a pretty good cough and, cold and runny nose, stuff like this, and was feeling like a truck ran over me for about 3 or 4 days, but I felt pretty good about it. But then I took care of myself after that. I need to lose some weight to get, because a sub-risk group here that I need to do that. I understand that. Ben, what do you think so far? Man, this is just, I have to listen to this guy 2 or 3 times and the light bulbs are just turning on here for me. It's incredible, the knowledge. What do you think here?
Yeah. So obviously I'm not in the medical industry. I'm a video producer, but I had COVID pneumonia for 2 weeks, pretty severe in the fall. And, hearing about all this infectious pressure and everything like that, how can I go forward, and is my natural immunity, is it solid? I mean, it seems like the more people are getting vaccinated during the pandemic, is it creating just like some super virus? And how can I like my friends and family about the importance of natural immunity, or like how effective is it going to be if more people continue to get vaccinated? Like what's happening with that?
Well, it's very, very clear. I mean, I hate to say this because I'm the last who would discriminate people, and I'm not discriminating people, but the science is the science. There's no way around. We have, in terms of the immune status and in terms of the immune defense against SARS-CoV-2, we have, from an immunological viewpoint, we have no choice but to distinguish between 2 immune statuses that are fundamentally different. The one is the one of the vaccinees, and the antibodies that they are generating have no longer neutralizing capacity. They are contributing, as I just explained to Wayne, to making the virus more infectious. So at the population level, that means they are doing anything but contributing to herd immunity, right? because herd immunity means that you can diminish the transmission of the virus. So you have to bring down the infectivity of the virus. That is not what you're doing by mass vaccination. On the contrary, you are promoting the expansion of more infectious viruses. That is one thing. Now, to your case, somebody who's not vaccinated, of course, some of the people who were not vaccinated got the disease. Some of them got even severe disease. Some of them got moderate disease. I mean, there is several different, but all those basically who recovered from the disease, they have trained their innate immune system, and they have also developed antibodies that are in fact more efficient in terms of the breadth, not in terms of the height, but in terms of the breadth. And with breadth, we mean the spectrum of variants that they can recognize. This spectrum is much larger if you got naturally infected or natural disease than when you got vaccinated. So in other words, I mean, your innate immunity, you have to see this, the innate antibodies, the innate immunity is not recognizing just like one element on the virus, for example, the spike. The innate antibodies, they can be trained, so they can improve on recognition of the virus. What they do is that they recognize patterns on the virus surface, and these are patterns of sugars. And these patterns of sugars are shared amongst all the variants. So this is the reason why innate antibodies are not very specific. They are not specific for spike, but they can recognize, we call them pathogen-specific motifs, pathogen-specific patterns. And these patterns are patterns of glycans, and these patterns are shared amongst all the variants, even amongst all coronavirus. And for that reason, even with other viruses that also have this envelope, for example, influenza virus. And why is this? I mean, there is no magic, there is no secret about this. The viruses we are talking about, they have an envelope. And this envelope originates from the cell, because a virus can only replicate in a living cell. And when this virus is going to, when it's going to leave the cell, it will be enveloped by part of the membrane of the cell. So that membrane of the cell has sugars that are, specific for our own body. We call them self-sugars, self-glycans, right? And the innate antibodies, they have an important task in recognizing the self-glycans, because they need to keep them under control. If we have too much of them, for example, too many of them, you could end up with autoimmunity, for example. So these innate antibodies, they need to regulate the self-glycans. As a matter of fact, because these viruses, they have come out of these cells, they are also carrying the self-glycans that are recognized by the innate antibodies and that are not specific for SARS-CoV-2, for one or the other variant, but that are broadly shared amongst many enveloped viruses, because they all have these glycan patterns on the surface. That is why they can broadly recognize a whole spectrum of different viruses. But they bind with less strength, with less affinity than specific antibodies. However, the thing that we didn't know back 10, 15 years ago was that these innate antibodies can be trained through a disease experience. They can, if you got a disease, for example, your innate immune system had this disease fighting experience. Thanks to this disease fighting experience, these innate antibodies, they will be better adapted to deal with this virus. They will increase their affinity while still having a broad spectrum of recognition. And this training is critically important. That is why I'm saying people who have gone through this training are not vaccinated, for God's sake, they will be very well protected against the upcoming variants, etc., under one single condition. They need to be in good health. you have to compare this. When you do this weightlifting, for example, and you are training, you start with 10 kilograms, then you go to 20 to 50, you got the 50 kilograms, you lift this above your head. But if you are now, for example, you got ill or you got a hangover from the day before, etc., so you're not fit, you're not feeling fine, you got trained, but nevertheless, you will not be able to lift this 50 kilograms because you're not in good health. And that is why I'm saying, if you have gone through this training and you take care of your health, for God's sake, yes, body weight, yes, exercise, yes, healthy food, yes, mental rest, physical rest, etc. Stress, okay, but positive stress. I mean, I'm not saying that you may not get mild disease or maybe be 1 or 2 days in bed. But what is wrong about this? If you would know before that you're just going to be 1 or 2 days in bed, you wouldn't be scared. You wouldn't be. People are now scared because they think, oh, I got it. I could die, right? And that is completely wrong. I hope to some extent having answered your question a little bit. So in other words, yeah, if you're not vaccinated, you recovered from this. You don't need to worry too much, but take good care of your health. And everybody, even all unvaccinated, will go, of course, through some kind of disease with the Omicron. But after that, my prediction is that for the unvaccinated in good health, to a very large extent, they will be done. They will be done with the virus. In contrast, unfortunately, to the vaccinees.
Well, okay, now you just, the point here you just made is there's news reports out from Moderna and Pfizer through the United States FDA that they're saying they'll be able to produce an omni-variant vaccination or vaccine later this summer or early fall. What's that going to do if it's targeted directly towards Omicron? Will that create other problems for those who get the vaccine or create something in the variants to mutate even to a worse state? What do you think about that?
Well, when you are going to answer that question with my help, this vaccine that they will make, what they will be doing is that they will primarily use the receptor binding domain of the Omicron, which is in fact is new. Remember, 20 mutations at least, right? They will focus especially on that one. So that is a new thing. But I told you about the non-neutralizing antibodies.
Right.
Non-neutralizing antibodies are directed against another domain of the spike protein, not the receptor binding domain. Against another domain, we call it, you don't have to remember this, but we call it the N-terminal domain of the spike protein. And that antigenic site that is recognized by the non-neutralizing antibodies, and this is important, is conserved amongst all the variants, amongst all the different versions of the spike protein. So that means that very domain that is conserved will also be part of the spike protein that Moderna will be using, and where they will primarily have, used the receptor binding domain of the Omicron. So now, if you inject this, what is going to happen? What is going to happen? Receptor binding domain is new. This is not known to the immune system.
Right.
The other domain has been presented to the immune system multiple times because it was present in the previous vaccines and is present in all the variants. I told you it's a conserved domain. So in other words, the immune system has not been primed yet against the new receptor binding domain, the Omicron part of the receptor, but it has been primed very thoroughly, against the conserved site that elicits non-neutralizing antibodies. So why am I telling this? If you are now going to give this vaccine to people, the first thing that will happen within 24 hours is that you will have a tremendous increase in the non-neutralizing antibodies, because those have been primed. The new antibodies, there is no priming. The immune system needs to go through that full process of maturation, building it. It will take time. Probably you will get 2 shots before you would have this full-fledged immunity. But in the meantime, these non-neutralizing antibodies are going, just go through the roof within a few days. I was telling you that these non-neutralizing antibodies, they are responsible for the increased infectivity of the virus. And of course, the people that get vaccinated, we are still in a pandemic, don't forget this. So they will, even those who get vaccinated with Omicron, they will get in contact, a large part of them will get in contact with the virus, sooner or later, while sitting on high titers of non-neutralizing antibodies because they have been boosted. So that will primarily enhance the infectivity of the virus, but and that is more problematic. I told you the very same antibodies at a lower respiratory tract are exerting immune pressure on the virulence of the virus, So if you are now widely going to use this Omicron vaccine, what you're going to do is a second mass vaccination where you are now going to put massive pressure, no longer on the infectiousness of the virus, that was the stage before, but you're now going to put massive immune pressure on the virulence of the virus. So to answer your question, what you're going to do is you're going to just expedite the emergence of new variants that are not only highly infectious, but are also highly virulent with this.
Oh man, this is what my friend Dr. James Lyons-Weiler was talking to me about. He mentioned that the mutations could end up being killing more indiscriminately and more virulently. This is nuts. This is crazy.
Yeah, of course it's crazy, but the problem is that the approach of health authorities, key opinion leaders, and of course also politicians has been scientifically incredibly simplistic and incredibly naive. You have to imagine this is an interplay between the virus and the immune system, a viral host ecosystem that has been shaped for millions of years, this type of ecosystems, right? It's very, very well done. We throw a bombshell on this and, to destroy this full equilibrium and then think that we will get this under control. This is, this interplay is not just in your body, in my body, it's at the population level. And you hear me always talking about the population level. Why? Because if you are vaccinated or you just vaccinate, for example, one segment of the population, like we do with influenza, we vaccinate the elderly, you are not going to put tremendous immune pressure on the virus by just vaccinating one age group, right? If you do this across all age groups in a way that is not capable of killing the virus, of inducing sterilizing immunity, but leaving the door open for that virus to go to its garage and to see whether there is another off-road motorcycle that is better adapted to this rough landscape of immune pressure, then it will take that one, right? And that will become dominant. So this is, and then the immune intervention, the vaccination and all the kinds of infection prevention measures we are taking. So this is very, very complex. This is not just about virology. So this is not about Fauci, who doesn't understand anything about immunology. This is also about immunology. This is about vaccinology. This is about evolutionary biology. This is even about biophysics. If you compare how specific antibodies bind to the spike protein compared to innate antibodies that have lower affinity but are multivalent, they recognize a pattern, they recognize the full surface, not just some specific elements on that surface. So things are complex. And that is why we have been really begging for a scientific debate, to clarify this and to make clear to people that this is not all easy and we need to discuss this and we need to go into the detail. We cannot afford leaving any stone unturned. And then you have these politicians and simplistic health authorities, who come and say, you know what, to the people, it's all very easy. shut up and get the vaccine. It's just going to protect yourself and your kids, not realizing that the protection against severe disease that you're claiming right now is not doing anything else but putting the virus under tremendous immune pressure with regard to its virulence. And the virus will overcome this. Why? Because it can still replicate. Look, the infection rates have never been that high. If you cannot dramatically diminish the infection rate, you cannot diminish the transmission. Therefore, you cannot get to herd immunity. Therefore, you cannot stop the pandemic, right? It's all very, very straightforward.
Okay, well, let me take you back to January 2020, before the big outbreak worldwide. What would you have done to stop the spread of the coronavirus, COVID virus? Would you have kind of hunkered down and sequestered or sheltered the elderly and those with poor health into an area and kind of protected them and let everybody else just kind of walk through the world naturally? What would have been the best way to address this virus back then to get us to herd immunity worldwide?
Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, very clearly, that would have been more or less the strategy, in a sense that, and remember, there's only one thing you have to keep in mind if you talk about the pandemic and about controlling a pandemic, which is herd immunity. And what is the definition of herd immunity? Herd immunity is a kind of immunity that a population acquires and that allows the population to diminish the transmission of the virus to an extent such that even the vulnerable people have such a low risk of getting exposed to the virus that they are almost automatically protected. So how does that translate to the answer to your question? Well, very easy. Of course, all the people who were in good health, even people 80 years old, in good health, no underlying disease, etc., no need whatsoever, certainly not for vaccinating them. Of course, these people could have gotten disease, could have gotten moderate, mild disease, etc. They recover. I think I've just, explained that the natural immunity is really, because it induces sterilizing immunity, that is the most important pillar of herd immunity. So once you get that herd immunity, you don't have to care anymore about the vulnerable people, because I was just saying that's the definition of herd immunity, that you will automatically protect them. Until that happens, yes, in our communities where, it's our civilization, it's our society, we isolate people, elderly people in elderly homes. Of course, this is a big concentration of very vulnerable people. It's at high risk, of infections because of the high infectious pressure if something happens there. So you have to protect those communities. You essentially, referring to Peter McCullough and so many others, have to make sure that you have early treatment in place, that you can immediately intervene, that you can protect to some extent infection prevention measures, early treatment, but only protect them for as long as it is needed, namely until you have reached herd immunity, which was impossible because they started vaccinating all the healthy people, just preventing them from building herd immunity. And hence, we cannot, this community cannot protect the vulnerable because, there is no herd immunity.
Okay. If early treatment was available, as McCullough and a few others, would we have prevented a majority of the deaths worldwide? Or do we have a chance on that? Or
yes, of course, not all of them, but let's be very serious about this. And I hate to say this, but this is reality. We as a society have to accept that we will lose people 85 and older who have underlying diseases, and not that I think it's a good thing, not that I'm making fun of this, but this is how things, how societies remain also strong and You know, we have been complaining about our societies aging and et cetera, et cetera. So, but ethically, we need to do whatever we can to save lives. So yes, we would have to protect these people, you know, to take care of these people. We would have to make sure that they had early treatment. As a consequence of that, we would have saved maybe 50% of these people, you know, very clearly. But we would have lost people. But I can tell you something, is that by the strategy that has been implemented right now, the number of losses in terms of human lives, you know, I mean, will be unprecedented. It will be not comparable at all, compared to having a natural pandemic, you know, and doing the right thing, namely make sure that we can develop herd immunity as soon as possible, certainly not by locking up youngsters and children and by wearing masks, and protecting for some time as good as we can the vulnerable people, not just the elderly, but also people with underlying disease who are immune suppressed, etc.
Okay. We received a couple questions from a few people, listeners, prior to the show. We talked about scientific debate and the lack of actual debate. You were talking about it, that we had public health was kind of naive about what they were doing. What can we do moving forward in regards to scientific debate? Is there a possibility that we can do something like that?
I see only one possibility, and you may laugh about it, but we have to replace vaccine mandates by debate mandates. It should become a mandate. These guys should be forced to engage into a scientific discussion, should be forced by law to engage in scientific discussions with people like me, you know, Pierre Corrie, Peter Nicolo, you name them, you know, Paul Alexander, etc., etc.
Yeah, right.
If that is not an obligation, you know, and they can just reject this, and they can just make fun of us and ridicule us, right, in writings and through social media, etc. They need to be an obligation for them to engage in an open and public discussion, a discussion that people can follow. Even if they don't understand the science, they will see how parties confront each other and how they discuss with each other. And they will at least, they will have the impression. I would already be very satisfied when laymen would at least get the impression, oh, wow, what you're telling us is very, very simplistic. It seems to be a little bit more complex and complicated than that. So maybe there is an interest for me, in the interest of myself and my child, you know, to gather some more information about this and, you know, to start asking questions, right? And that is simply not happening. And as long as it's not mandatory, I mean, it's just, you know, it's just a joke. It's just a joke. Yeah.
Bravo. That's wonderful. That really surprised me. Ben, what do you think? I mean, scientific mandate debates. What do you think of that? I like that.
Absolutely. And just a question for you, Geert. You used to put out YouTube videos. Are you planning on doing that again? And is there any hope that you can kind of give people that are that want to be soldiers with you to go forward and make sure that you can get out there and debate and have these discussions? Is there anything people can do to help you? And is there inside information you can give us on what it is that you're doing with your colleagues?
Well, the way people can help us, but of course, I mean, don't misunderstand me, but Ben, the people who need help, it's not, you know, the scientists like myself, like Peter McCullough, like Bob Malone, etc. It's the people who are sitting on these questions, who don't know what to do, who see or are confronted all the time with this bloody narrative and with these advertisements to get their children vaccinated. So what we are trying to do is, through interviews and documentaries, I think I will have a quite powerful interview with Del Bigtree again, on the high wire. It will be aired on this coming Thursday. There is also, you may have seen the documentary on Headwind of Robert Malone. The documentary of Headwind will also appear very soon. So this is not about us. I mean, I hate to be on all this media, etc. But it's about the message, and I think the interview with Del is very special. I mean, I got to know Del, as somebody who is really very rigorous about the science. He has a scientific team. We never do interviews, just ad hoc. He plans this. We have like 2 or 3 hours before scientific discussions. He has a team. They get back to me with questions, etc. And I think this interview is very, very powerful because I'm really challenging guys like Fauci, Paul Offit, etc., that are just, having people should ask themselves, first of all, the questions, do these guys maybe have any conflict of interest, right? Could that be, right? I mean, how can you just follow what somebody who has a really very profound conflict of interest, how can you just follow these people, follow what they're saying? So people need to have a critical mind, for God's sake. So we can only spread information. We can only answer to questions. I can only show my passion, my conviction. I can only say, guys, if I'm wrong, you have the right to put me in prison. Is there any of these health officials? Is there any of these key opinion leaders who is ready to tell this, that they can throw them in jail when they're wrong, when the outcome is going to be catastrophic? What do people think when they find out that they have conflicts of interest, when they are not willing to engage in scientific debates with us? Whereas what we are telling is based on science, on evidence, on a long-standing career, 30 years of virology, immunology, vaccinology, you name it, right? So that, it needs to ring a bell with people, especially for the children, right? That's the only thing people can help us and themselves with is, raising awareness is what we need to do.
Well, I appreciate your humility as far as not needing help, but I mean, you're a fighter, and most people aren't fighters, but they need to help the fighters. So I think going forward, people really need to view you like a soldier and get behind you and all that. So, I mean, continue doing what you're doing with everything. It's incredible work.
Yeah, well, and the important thing is that we, some people tend to, become more political. I think it's important that some people engage also more in this political path. I'm not doing this. I'm really stick to the science because I think, the science is really the truth, and I know that the science will win. Because the science is the truth, and the truth, will surface, right? That is why I'm so convinced, and why I'm really sticking to the science, because that is the path that will ultimately reveal the truth, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to call it a day here. I know you got a busy schedule, but I told you we'd stay on for about an hour, so thank you very much. To our viewers, you've been watching the Right on Point podcast. I want to thank my guest today. It has been truly amazing and an honor for Geert Vanden Bossche to be with us, along with my producer and friend Ben Smith. And thank you to many of the watchers of this program. As I leave you each week with the following: keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and always, always question authority.